My name is Jose. I'm originally from the state of San Luis Potosi in Mexico, born 17 kilometers from the city of Matehuala. That's where I was born. I didn't know the gospel, nor did my parents know what Christ had done on the cross at Calvary, because I come from a completely Catholic and religious family. My parents say that ever since my grandparents' time, there was a tendency to worship idols they made themselves, whether out of wood, plaster, stone, or paper. After talking to these idols, we would go to the Catholic Church, where a priest would sprinkle holy water on them before they were sent to build altars and be worshipped in those places. People had the habit of worshiping these images, and I remember my parents telling me that these devotions would start from one day to the next, lasting 24 hours, with people offering worship to the images. Sometimes, these devotions and the idols would result in 2-day-long festivals where many people lost their lives and many lost their marriages. That was the consequence of these devotions. My parents were deeply religious, defending their faith even with their lives, because they believed it was the legacy of their ancestors. This was the only knowledge spread among my family and the people living in those ranches back then. I'm talking about the 1950s. My parents say that the Americans used to fly over in small planes, dropping hundreds of biblical literature. However, as soon as the literature hit the ground, people would pick it up, and those who worked for the Catholic Church would collect it and say that being Protestant or evangelical was like following a satanic doctrine. So, the true message of salvation never reached the people's knowledge. I was born with features that alarmed my mother, like open eyes and visible teeth, which made her extremely worried. After 40 days, my mother took me to the idols to ask for an explanation about my peculiarities. Months passed without any answers. At 7 months old, to my parents' further surprise, I got up and started walking and talking perfectly, which was unusual and frightening to everyone who knew me. When I turned 2, my parents, still seeking answers, decided to take me to a doctor for the first time. Dr. Avila examined me and stated that I was completely healthy, without understanding why my mother was so worried. A week after, while my mother was feeding me, something terrible happened. My body convulsed, my eyes rolled back, and I fell to the ground paralyzed and cold, appearing to be dead. My mother, desperate, ran to the altars to beg for a miraculous return to life. Hours passed without any miracle. The healers in the area, after examining my body, declared me dead. My mother took me back home, and the community began to hold a wake for my body, placing flowers over it, as was the local custom. However, during the night, one of my aunts, while placing her flowers, felt compelled to check my heart and noticed a faint heartbeat. Immediately, she informed my mother, who, filled with hope, removed the flowers and, along with my father, began to gather money to take me to the best doctors in the state of San Luis Potosi. They fought hard to get me the best treatments, but despite their efforts, after 3.5 years, the most I could do was regain some movement in my neck while the rest of my body continued to deteriorate. I was able to regain my speech and open my eyes. When I looked at my body, I saw that it was very different from my brother's. My legs were withered, and my hands were twisted and deformed. I began to scream for my mother, desperate because I couldn't move. I would ask, "Mom, why is my body different from my brother's? Why can't I move or play with them? Why is my body like this?" I started to scream at my mother, wanting to move, but I couldn't. From that point on, all I knew was suffering and pain. I didn't have a happy childhood. Ever since I was little, I didn't know what it was to be happy. Years went by and my parents kept fighting. My father and mother tirelessly searched for ways to help me, taking me to medical consultations in hospitals. But after 7 years, my body was completely dried out. My legs were deformed, withered, and twisted. I remember when the hospitals and doctors began to close their doors to us, telling my mother that medical science could do nothing, that my disease was incurable, that it had destroyed my nerves and muscles, and that my body was dead. Medicine could do no more. I would soon die. When I heard that I was going to die, I screamed to my mother and father, begging them not to let me die. I was terrified because despite my paralyzed and deformed body, I was alive inside. My mother kept fighting to find the medication needed to restore my movement, but all avenues of cure closed for me, and all that was left was to wait for the moment of my death. I remember that at that time, there was a very famous doctor in the capital of San Luis, and he told my parents that if they could gather a large amount of money, he could offer a special treatment that might restore movement to my body. My parents began to struggle to raise this money, even leaving my brothers without food for 3 days. I remember one night when my older brother, who is now a pastor, would wake up at night reaching out and saying, "Mom, don't take the food away." He was delirious, thinking there was food, but all there was need and misery. When I heard my brother crying out for food, I would say that it was my fault he had nothing to eat because I was in that condition. Even so, my parents gathered the money and took me to that doctor, who prescribed 60 injections to be given to my stomach. The doctor told my father, "If your son doesn't respond to this treatment, it means there's no hope for him." The injections were administered, and by the time the last one was given, my stomach was completely ruined, and that treatment was a failure. The doctor told my father that there was no remedy for me either. I remember my mother would wake up at night and place her hand over my nose, waiting for the moment when I would stop breathing as I was condemned to die. The locals would say to my mother, "Why don't you dig a hole in the ground and bury your son? The warmth of the earth might cure him." Driven by ignorance and desperation, my mother did what people told her. She would dig a hole in the ground every morning and bury me up to my neck. I would stay there all day, and in the afternoon she would take me out, a paralyzed, deformed, and dried-out body. I remember my mother pleading with me, "Son, move your hands, move your legs," and I would say, "Mom, I can't." People would tell her, "Bury him in a goat pen. The warmth from the manure might be healing." My mother tried everything, but my body remained paralyzed. We were just waiting for the moment of my death until one morning some people came to talk to my mother. They knew I had been abandoned by medical science and were aware of all the suffering my family had gone through. They told my mother they knew someone who could heal me. My mother, with her eyes and face bathed in tears, asked who could heal her son who was slowly dying. They showed her a book with the image of the Virgin of San Juan, the miraculous, saying that this virgin performed miracles and that if my mother made a sacrifice, promising to collect alms from house to house and then ask for a miracle in the city of Matahuala, the Virgin could heal me. My mother accepted, and the next day she started asking for alms from house to house. People sometimes mocked her, but she kept going, even barefoot and bleeding from walking on the stone paths. I saw my mother suffer and cry, and I felt guilty for all that suffering. But she would comfort me, saying that no matter the sacrifice, she would do everything for my cure. So we lived, gathering money for the trip to San Juan de los Lagos, hoping for a miracle that never came. My mother would occasionally go out to shoo away the flies that covered my face. For today, that would just be a memory of when she would leave with tears in her eyes after completing an exhausting task. She would look at me, wishing she could do something to help. "No matter what they tell me, I will endure everything to gather this money," she would say, and they took me to where the miraculous Virgin was. My mother, as best as she could, gathered 15 pesos to go to the state of Jalisco, where the Virgin of San Juan de los Lagos is located. We were told to join those who were making pilgrimages to the temple so that we could find relief quickly. I soon realized that I was not the only one suffering, but many others were too. I noticed that those who made pilgrimages to the temple didn't always manage to gather the money they were asked for. Men and women would walk up to 20 blocks on their knees until their knees bled, offering their sick bodies as a sacrifice. Meanwhile, others would carry cacti, letting the thorns dig into their hands until they bled, and some would even pierce themselves with sharp objects, all in search of a miracle. Despite everything, my father and mother kept walking until they reached the temple. Once there, my mother deposited the amount she had gathered with so much sacrifice. The people in the temple exclaimed that it was all made of gold. Its columns were gold because the Virgin was miraculous. They showed her parts of the enormous temple and said, "Look, this Virgin, her crown is gold and worth millions of pesos because she is pure and powerful." After they showed her all of this, my mother took me in her arms and presented me before the altar. She fell to her knees, desperate, while I lay prostrate, crying out for a miracle. I started hearing my mother's cries as she said, "I didn't hold back. I brought everything, even the last of what we had, And now my children are without food because I gave you everything, even without knowing you. But I know you are miraculous. I've placed all my faith in you. Perform the miracle. Raise my son who is slowly dying, and with him, I am dying too. I've placed my trust in you. Raise him." All that day, my mother kept begging for the miracle, and when night came, she was still pleading. The next morning, her eyes were swollen, and her throat was sore from so much pleading, but the miracle didn't come. Then the people who worked at the temple told her, "Ma'am, if the virgin doesn't want to perform the miracle, use the miraculous water from this well. Take your son and wash him with this water, and the miracle will happen. The virgin has performed countless miracles here." While saying this, they asked for more money. My mother took me to that water, which was dirty, and began to wash my body while crying out for the virgin to perform the miracle. I remember my mother telling me, "Move your hands, move your legs," and I would reply, "Mom, I can't." Then someone suggested, "Ma'am, give him this earth. This earth is miraculous. Many people who consumed it have been healed. Why don't you try giving him some of this earth? There lies the solution, there lies the miracle, there lies the healing for your son's body." With her faith already worn out, my mother started buying sacks of that earth. For the 2 weeks we stayed in that place, my mother fed me that earth. After 2 weeks, my father and mother realized that it had all been a lie, a fraud that had only exploited my mother's ignorance and used my body to extract money in exchange for a non-existent miracle. We returned home, to the ranch where we lived, worse off than when we left, without money and carrying an even heavier burden. When we arrived at the ranch, the people who had donated money for that alms realized that I had returned. The religious people, those who only had faith in those idols, started coming to our house, thinking that I had been cured, that I could walk, that the miraculous image had healed my body. People crowded around the door asking to come in. When the first person entered and saw my corner, where I had been lying for 7 years, they left without saying anything, and the same happened with everyone else who came in afterward. There was nothing to ask. No miracle had occurred. There was my body, paralyzed and weakened. Everything had been based on lies. When it became clear that the man didn't know how to help, he turned to me and with a firm command said, "Now I order you to get up and start walking." As he gave this order, my body didn't move, not even a tremor. Seeing this, his eyes widened and he exclaimed, "You are condemned to death. Everyone has condemned you, and for you there is no cure, because everyone who has tried to treat you has said that there is no medicine, and that's true. You have something so serious that I cannot handle it." Hearing these words, my father became sad, and my mother, standing by, cried desperately, screaming, knowing that I would have to face death. As he talked to this teacher, though generous offers were made, he just looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Look, I've never seen disease in my family. We've never had sick people, but soon I'll stop being a rural teacher. I'm heading into politics where I'll become a federal congressman. In political campaigns, there are very wealthy people who, when I extend my hand, will place their money in it, and I want to tell you that I've chosen to help you. I will gather large sums of money and take you to the best doctors because you're in this condition due to not being treated by specialists." As the teacher spoke, tears streamed down my face, and he asked why I was crying if he was going to help me. I responded, "Teacher, we are so poor that I don't know what it's like to have money. When you talk about helping me, I see a light entering my life, and I see myself walking." The teacher then asked what my greatest wish was, and I said it was to hug my mother because when she saw me walking, I knew she would stop crying. He promised he would fight for me, and if he could cure me, all of Mexico would know that he had done a worthy act of charity. He took me in his arms and went back home to explain to my parents the plan he had made to gather the money. My father, knowing we were poor and didn't even have enough to eat, listened as the teacher promised that through politics, he would get the money needed for my treatment. The days passed, and the teacher organized political meetings, later returning to inform us that everything was arranged. The wealthiest and most influential people were interested in helping, and all that was left was for them to see me. They promised to donate all the money needed for my treatment. The next day, we left for the city. The teacher took me without shame, despite people around us mocking me. We arrived at luxurious offices where he placed me on an elegant sofa. An elegant man appeared, and upon seeing my condition, he began to cry, saying he had never seen such a great injustice, and promised to donate all the money needed for the best hospital and doctors, promising that if I were cured, it would be a great act of charity. My parents, upon hearing this, were torn between the joy of a possible cure and the fear of losing me, because if I were admitted and didn't survive, my mother wanted to be by my side. With all the promises of help, I felt a mix of hope and fear. I wanted to live and be happy, but the idea of being separated from my family for treatment was painful. However, I was willing to face that pain if it meant the chance to walk again. Finally, my father accompanied me to the hospital to start the treatment that would last 3 years, filled with hopes of a cure and a better future. When we arrived at the best hospital in the city, I clearly remember that as soon as we entered the waiting room for the first time, there was a priest and a Catholic nun in an office. As soon as we entered, the Trinitarians, who had never seen us before, came to meet my father and asked for his name. My father told them, and they said they had been expecting us. "Now, make your son comfortable on this sofa and come with us," they instructed. My father went with the priest, and meanwhile, I was left wondering where my father was. My father later explained to me that this hospital was completely Catholic, and that the people admitted here needed to go to confession, and he was going to do that. While my father was in confession, Mother Neves, who was responsible for guiding me, invited us to go up to the 5th floor where a room had been reserved for me. We reached the 5th floor and entered a room that seemed very luxurious to me, especially considering the 7 years I had spent sick, lying in a corner without a proper bed. Once in the room, my mother received cold instructions. "Put your son in the bed and leave immediately. Go to the office, and there you will receive all the necessary information about your son's treatment. You will be informed about when you can visit him. If you come before or after the specified time, you will not be able to see him. The Catholic Church dictates these rules and is very strict, so come exactly at the appointed time." When I saw that my father was about to leave and leave me alone in that room, I started crying and said, "Dad, I don't want to stay here." My father came back with tears in his eyes. When the others walked away, I started crying again, and the nun tried to comfort me. "Don't cry, we're prepared to do good. We've been trained to provide you with the best treatment, which has been paid for to heal you. You'll stay here as part of the treatment, and although it's sad that you can't walk in the gardens because everything is restricted, don't be sad. We're here to take care of you." I decided to endure the pain of not seeing my mother for 3 years, but I knew I would walk out of there. I knew I would be cured, and that one day I would return and hug my mother. I closed my eyes and waited for the moment when I would have to walk, fueled by that illusion growing inside me. Soon, a nurse told me that a specialist would come to examine me. Shortly after, Dr. Rodolfo Rico arrived from Spain, accompanied by 5 other doctors, who immediately began examining my body. I asked the doctor, "What is marking my body?" He told me that treatment would begin soon and expressed great hopes that I could walk. On the day the operations were to begin, I was taken to the surgical center. Every time a surgery was performed, my father was there, receiving all the information. After several operations, I asked my father when I could walk. He always said that the doctors were optimistic and that the treatment would be a success. Almost 2 years passed, and despite many surgeries, my body was still paralyzed. My father reassured me, saying that everything was going well. I longed to see my mother, but only my father was allowed to visit me. Finally, after the last operation, Dr. Rico came with a serious expression and informed me that the treatment had been a failure. He explained that although many previous surgeries had been successful with other patients, my case was different, because my nerves and muscles were dead and the disease was now destroying my bones. Devastated by the news, I realized that I would never walk. The doctor prepared me for discharge, explaining that he had notified my family to come and get me since the hospital would no longer continue my treatment. With a broken heart and no hope, I accepted that my condition was incurable and that all efforts to heal me had been in vain. As the man signed the paperwork, I continued crying in pain and bitterness. He approached again and said, "Look, Jose, you're not the only person with an incurable disease. Accept it. You'll soon die. And after death, all this suffering will end." I heard that word again that made me shudder, the idea that I would have to die. But finally, I accepted that there was no cure for me. He told me that my father would come to get me soon, as that was all that could be done. The man left the room and I thought, when my father arrives, I'm going to tell him how they deceived me, how they separated me from my mother, why they said they would cure me, and why they performed so many surgeries on my body if I wasn't going to be cured. Minutes passed, and my father appeared. When I saw his face, I noticed that it was cold, and I couldn't say anything. I just felt the kiss he gave me as he said, "I finally came to get you." I remember my father picking me up in his arms and carrying me out of the hospital. My father began walking through the streets leading to the center of Saltillo, where the bus office was, for the buses that would take us back home. As my father walked blocks with me in his arms, I heard a noise in his chest, a murmur, and I thought my father was tired. I lifted my face to look at him and saw that it wasn't fatigue, but that he was crying. My father then said, "Son, I have no money to feed you. I have no money to take us home. I don't know what to do. The people who were donating money were informed by the doctor that you have an incurable disease and they withdrew all the help. That's why I couldn't be there for your last surgeries, because there was no more financial help. Today marks 10 years since you became paralyzed. In these 10 years I have suffered a lot, son. I saw you completely healthy, but now my eyes have seen how your body has withered. That last hope ended when the specialist said your disease is incurable. I have suffered so much with you, son, and I can't bear to keep seeing the condition you're in. I would rather you die. I know it will hurt to know that you're going to die, but once you do, my eyes won't see it anymore, and I won't suffer anymore. In time, everything fades, son. One day, I will come to terms with it." My father and I kept walking until we crossed the city and reached the highway exits that lead to our state. My father took off a jacket he had and placed my body on the side of the road, and there he started to hitchhike. Nearby, there was a gas station where cargo trucks often stopped. Finally, a truck stopped to refuel, and my father asked the driver if he could give us a ride. I remember that while my father was talking to that man, he approached and showed him my body. My father explained, "My son is 10 years old, he's sick, he became paralyzed. His body is completely deformed. He spent 3 years hospitalized, treated by a specialist, but his legs, my son has no cure. We're so poor that I don't even have money to take my son home. Could you help us?" The driver, seeing my condition, said, "As it happens, I'm passing along the road where you need to go. I'll help you. I can't take your son in the cab because it's already occupied, but there's space in the back of the truck among the cargo. Settle him there so he won't be exposed to the wind, and I'll take you." And so, my father settled my body as the driver instructed. During the journey, the truck began to speed up a lot, and after a few kilometers, the truck, perhaps due to the high speed and the poor road conditions, started to lose control and overturn. The entire load of galvanized sheets slid over my body, breaking my hands, ribs, and recently operated legs. My stomach ruptured, and I began to bleed from my mouth, nose, and ears. I heard my father's desperate screams saying that I was dead, that the load had destroyed me. Those screams started to fade away, and suddenly, I began to feel that I was leaving that shattered body. I saw a deep abyss opening, a darkness moving, and I began to ascend downward. I knew I had died, but I didn't know where I was going. I wanted to scream for my father, but I couldn't. I felt an agonizing pain as I entered that abyss, that sticky darkness like walls closing in and causing the sharpest pain. My whole life had been filled with suffering, but now this suffering I felt in my soul and spirit was different. Suddenly, I saw a light penetrating that darkness, a light that enveloped my body, and I was caught up in it. I found myself standing before a massive white throne, and a thundering voice shook the place, saying, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, the Chosen One. Though you don't know me, I know you, for I have set my eyes on you. Satan knew that I had chosen you, so he destroyed you, but I defeated Satan on the cross of Calvary. I give you life. For those I hold in my hands, I give life." We were being tormented. We were lost, and I started to scream, saying, "I can't take this. Who am I? Where did I come from?" The Lord said to me, "Don't go away, because I am with you. Here, no one is innocent, for everyone knew that I was their Savior, that I shed my blood on the cross of Calvary for them, and yet they chose to sin. Therefore, they are guilty." He then continued, I will return to the starting point. At the right time, you will speak in my name, because I am Jesus of Nazareth. I was taken out of that darkness, and as I left, it felt like I had never lived before. My father said that 2 hours had already passed since I was pulled from the wreckage. They had already called an ambulance to collect my remains, but it hadn't arrived yet. According to my father, people started to gather around the accident site where my shattered body lay. Journalists from the city of Saltillo began taking photos of my destroyed body. My father said that my mouth was still full of blood, and it was still dripping from my ears. I was completely disfigured. The police arrived to confirm that I was dead. The driver, realizing there was a fatality, fled, leaving the truck behind. As people gathered, my father looked at my body and felt like crying. Just hours earlier, he had said he would rather I die, and now he saw how I had ended up. He remembered how I had suffered all my life and how I had lost my life. He started to feel remorse and wanted to get away from the people to cry. But as he moved away a bit, a voice from heaven was heard, shaking the place. Everyone was stunned by that powerful voice that said, "I am Jesus, I am life. Open your mouth and breathe into him, and he will live to testify of my power. For I hold him in my hands, and he will testify of what I have shown him. I am life. Just breathe into his mouth, and he will live." My father said that powerful voice was so strong that it made him run back to me while the people gathered around my body. He said, "Son, I will breathe into your mouth." Even though it was full of blood, he pressed his lips to mine and blew. Once he breathed into me, I opened my eyes and said, "Dad, I'm okay." The people around ran to see the shattered body that had spoken. They immediately brought a taxi and took me back to the hospital. I fell into a coma, and from that moment, my father was mentally affected by that powerful voice. I was taken back to the same public hospital where I had been hospitalized for 3 years. There, my father left, and I was alone. I spent weeks in a coma, a month and a half, and then I opened my eyes. There was a nun next to my bed, along with a nurse, and I asked where I was. They told me I was back in the hospital, a month and a half after the accident. I asked where my father and mother were. They told me it had been a month and a half since I had been left there and that they had tried to contact them, but no one had come to visit me. I said I was hungry, and they informed me that I couldn't eat because my stomach was damaged. They needed to feed me through IVs, but that would cost money, and my family hadn't come to claim me. All they had done was bandage my body. The nun approached and said they didn't know how I was still alive, given that my body was in pieces. The doctors didn't want to treat me because my family hadn't shown up. They needed money, they needed plaster, but so far, no one had come to ask about me. They didn't understand how my heart was still beating, how I was still speaking. I gathered my thoughts and remembered that voice full of love and mercy that had seen my body completely healed. I remembered that voice that had told me he was Jesus, and that he had given his life on the cross of Calvary for me. I remembered that beautiful city I had seen, that wedding ceremony in heaven, and that place of torment. I began to cry out from that day, feeling like I couldn't die, that my body wasn't moving, that I was back in that shattered body, and I started to call out and cry out to Jesus. Here I am, I can't move. The doctor told me that he would raise me up, that he would give me life. Look for him. He must be nearby because he took me and showed me a city that shined. He took me and showed me a wedding in heaven, and he took me to a place where many people were screaming, and he told me that all who didn't accept his sacrifice would be there. He told me that I would be in his hands, and that no one could snatch me from his hands. Tell him I'm here, that he should come and raise me up. And from that day, I began to shout continuously. I was returned to my hospital room, and since then, I remember that the nuns and nurses would enter the room slowly whenever I stopped shouting, thinking I might die at any moment since I had fulfilled the Catholic Church's rituals. The weeks passed, and I kept shouting louder. A force entered my lungs, and I cried out even more. Tell Jesus I'm here, that I can't move. He told me he would raise me, that he loved me, that I would be safe in his arms. Tell him I'm here, that I can't move. As the weeks went by, my cries grew more intense, echoing through the halls. I remember when the Mother Superior came to me and said, "Stop shouting. Your cries are making everyone nervous. They're keeping the sick from sleeping. We don't know how to explain how you have the strength to shout after your lungs were destroyed, but your cries are making us nervous. Why won't you be quiet? Why are you shouting?" I replied, "It's because Jesus told me he would raise me, that he would call me. Tell him I'm here." 2 months and 3 weeks passed, and not even the dressings on my weakened and paralyzed body were changed. The nun then told me, "I'm going to authorize specialists to come and examine you, but you need to stop shouting." I remember when the doctors arrived, placed me on a stretcher, and took me to a room full of equipment. They started placing devices on my head. In the accident, my skull had been exposed, my neck was fractured, and the wound was still open. One morning, the Mother Superior appeared with papers in her hand, and with an enraged expression while I was shouting that powerful name I had learned through death, she said, "Stop shouting! You're the most disgusting being I've ever seen. Not only are you paralyzed, your body is in shambles, you're insane. We have proof now in my hands. Psychiatrists examined you and found blood in your brain, a result of that injury from the accident. You're having hallucinations because of the brain trauma. You didn't go anywhere, no one spoke to you. It's all just a product of your sick mind. You didn't see anything. You're just a repulsive lunatic. All you do is cause problems. That's why your father and mother abandoned you. You're good for nothing but causing trouble. But I've authorized them to take you out of this room and move you to a place where you can scream all you want. There, no one will be bothered by you. Only the dead go there, and you'll die soon. We don't know how you've lasted this long. It's been 3 months and 3 weeks. We don't understand how you still have the strength." As that woman despised me and my body rotted since the bandages weren't being changed, a nurse and a nun put me on a stretcher and took me to the end of the corridor, to a room. When we got there, I saw that people covered their faces as they entered, and I quickly understood why. It was a place where people screamed, and the stench was unbearable, a mixture of decay and despair. They threw my body onto a useless box, and the nun and nurse said, "Here, you can scream all you want. Here, no one is bothered. People only leave here dead, and we know your days are numbered." While I was in that room, I saw and heard the cries of pain from other patients, including a woman with cancer that had rotted her abdomen, and a deformed young man who screamed in hunger and ate his own feces. I knew that soon they would take me out of there too. I kept shouting that I wasn't crazy, that everything I had cried out was true, but there, no one listened to me. Weeks went by, and my voice began to fail. That afternoon, when my voice finally gave out, a nurse and a nun came in, bringing a young man who had been bitten by a snake. They said he wouldn't survive the night because the venom had contaminated his entire bloodstream. While he screamed in pain, they approached my bed. It had been a week since I was put in that room, and no one had come near my bed since then. The bed was filthy, no one had cleaned it, and I lay in it, my body rotting, the bandages dirty. The nun then approached, saw that I was still alive, and said with disgust, "You haven't died yet, you repugnant thing? Still alive? We don't know how you're still breathing. You only cause disgust." She then grabbed my hair and started smashing my head against the edge of the bed. Even with the back of my head open, she hit me mercilessly, screaming, "Die, because you only cause disgust." With my eyes, I wanted to tell her that everything I had shouted was true, that Jesus had taken me, that he had spoken to me, that he had said he would raise me, but my voice was gone. I only had my gaze. After she finished beating me, they left, leaving me alone that afternoon. My eyes began to close. I no longer had the strength to keep them open, and I could only hear the cries of that young man suffering. Night came, and I felt that I was going to die. In the early morning, when everything was quiet, when the doctors and nurses had stopped walking through the corridors, when the sick had stopped screaming, and finally sleep overtook everyone, I started to hear footsteps echoing in that empty hospital. They were strange footsteps that had something sinister about them. I strained my ears, paying close attention to those footsteps that walked through the lonely corridor. The footsteps continued, heading toward the room where we, the forgotten ones, those who were worth nothing, were kept. The strange footsteps kept going until they stopped at the door of our room. Those footsteps came closer and stopped right beside my bed. I had the feeling that there was a human body next to me, but I couldn't open my eyes because I was too weak. I felt a face coming close to my ear, and I had the sensation that it was a human being. Suddenly I heard that voice full of love. A voice full of mercy, a voice I had never heard before, not even in the face of death. That voice, so powerful, said to me, "I am Jesus of Nazareth. I didn't come to lift you up, but so that in the name of the living God you may rise. Today you will walk because I am great and powerful. Now get up from that bed and start walking." I opened my eyes and saw that a light filled the entire room, a powerful light. I raised my hands and realized they were healed. I started to feel my body tremble. There was Jesus, the source of life. He said to me, "Get up and start walking because I am life. The world will know that I am great and powerful and that where I am, there is life." I felt powerful hands lift me by the waist, pulling me out of that bed. As soon as they lifted me, the hands let go and my body fell to the floor. When my feet touched the ground, I felt strength in my body and I began to walk. Jesus had gone, but he had healed me. He said to me, "I will use you to speak and I will be with you. I will answer everyone who questions you because I am Jesus." I started walking through all that fog of bitterness, sadness, and pain that disappeared because Jesus had entered my life. I felt, on that glorious morning of May 14th, 1966, that Christ had entered my life. From that day on, I put on my shoes, and I am the happiest person because Christ is my Savior. I continued walking in that room, and now I was walking in my own body. That young man who had been bitten by a snake, that young man the doctor said wouldn't survive, was walking. The people who saw it were astonished and began shouting down the hallway, "He's walking! He's walking!" Soon, the nuns, the nurses, the doctors, and even the priests came and found me standing. The nuns clutched their veils, fell to the ground, and said, "It can't be possible that you're walking. How are you walking?" I replied, "I'm walking because Jesus came and raised me. He's the one who healed me. Jesus came and told me that I would speak of the power and love of God in the last days. He told me that he is the one who lives and reigns and that he would fulfill his promises." The priests and specialists approached and asked me, "How are you walking?" They began to examine my body, and as they did, they realized that the fractures and wounds that were on my body were completely healed. Immediately, the nuns took me out of that room, washed my body, and took me to special rooms. I remember that every day they prayed with me, teaching me the Catholic doctrine, teaching me to write, and they said, "Something supernatural happened here. This can only be the work of God." And I said to them, "Jesus came and healed me." Even so, they continued to teach me to pray and use the rosary. I remember that once they dressed me in white and took me to a convent in the city of Saltillo. I was taken out of the hospital and brought to the convent, and there they told me that I needed to meet with the Catholic priest because they wanted to have an interview with me. The day finally came when they took me to the cathedral, where influential priests of the Catholic Church were waiting for me in a special place. When I arrived, they said to me, "We have information about what happened in your life, and we want you to explain everything you saw and felt while you were in the hospital. We want to know how you recovered your health because we have reports from doctors that you suffered from a severe illness, were paralyzed for 10 years, with parts of your muscles non-existent and your bones completely destroyed. And yet, your body is moving and medical science can't explain it. This can only be the work of a miracle." That's when I realized it was indeed a miracle. I started sharing parts of my testimony and they kept looking at each other, incredulous. They said, all right, go back with the nuns, they will prepare you." And they took me back to the convent. Over time, more priests gathered to hear what I had to say. I remember an occasion when they took me to where the bishops and priests were and they said, "We want to talk to you." I replied, "I need you to let me go because I want to see my father. Now, I know I can hug my mother, and when she sees me, she will be surprised to see me completely healed." All I could think about was my mother, and they said to me, "For you to see your mother, we're going to make a book, which will include many photographs. The Catholic Church is very interested in you, and we want to write this book." But they also said, "And it wasn't Jesus who spoke to you." One of the men stood up, showed me an image that was there, and said, "Look, it was St. Francis of Assisi who spoke to you. St. Francis of Assisi is the saint of the paralyzed, and you were paralyzed. This man lived to do good to invalids like you." I responded, "No, the one who healed me is named Jesus. I know St. Francis of Assisi because my parents took me to him several times, and he couldn't heal me. The one who healed me said his name is Jesus, and I will continue saying it was Jesus who healed me, even though I don't know where he went or where he is now, but he told me he would be with me. The men tried to convince me that it wasn't Jesus who healed me. After some time, they sent me back to the nuns and told them to make me forget the idea that it was Jesus I remember, that while the monks in the convent told me that I should say it was St. Francis of Assisi, they were planning to write a book about it, saying that St. Francis was a powerful man and that immediately after the publication I would see my parents. The Catholic Church had ordered that I should see my mother, who would be proud to know that the church was going to write a book about me. They were convinced that this would make me say it was St. Francis of Assisi. But I insisted that the one who healed me is named Jesus, and I would continue saying it was Jesus who healed me. The nun who had struck me before came to me, hugged me, and caressed me, saying that this was how Jesus looked at us, that we should not focus on appearances because, as the Bible says, he came not to condemn, but to save. I rejected their version, saying I wouldn't accept saying it was St. Francis if the one who healed me was Jesus. They became so irritated that they handed me over to the doctors again, hoping the doctors would make me forget this idea. When we arrived at the hospital, I was taken from room to room, where there were people who had been given up on by doctors, and they were told to have faith that St. Francis had performed a miracle on me. I had been paralyzed. I had been resurrected. My body was in pieces, but St. Francis did the miracle. I insisted that no, it was Jesus who healed me. They took me to the top floor of the hospital, where the nuns accompanied me to special rooms. There, they locked me in a room with completely unbalanced people and told me that if I didn't agree to say that it was St. Francis of Assisi, they would leave me there because they had psychiatric papers that claimed I was insane. Crying, I said I would never admit it was St. Francis because the one who healed me was Jesus. If he brought me back from death and lifted my body, he would know how to get me out of there. I would keep saying it was Jesus. The doctors then began to claim that they were the ones who had healed me, that they had found the right medication and the appropriate treatment, and that I could never prove otherwise. They gathered money, bought a lot of plaster, and decided to completely encase me in it as a form of mockery, saying that when they removed the plaster, I would see that they were the ones who had healed me. But as they were applying the plaster, a strange force began to be felt in the hospital. Suddenly, huge and powerful figures appeared, saying they had orders from the Almighty God to take me. They took me out of the hospital and placed me in a white carriage, telling me not to fear because God was with me. It wasn't long before I was home. My family wasn't home at that moment. They placed me in my humble bed, and those luminous figures ascended to the sky, leaving me alone. When my family arrived and saw that I was healed and could walk, they were shocked. My mother fainted from surprise, and my father and brothers were amazed. I explained that it was Jesus who healed me and showed them the marks from the plaster, as I could still feel the warmth of healing in my body. People from the community began to come to see me, bringing money not just as a donation, but also because they wanted to see and hear about the miracle. I told everyone that it was Jesus, but they asked where he was, how they could see him. I didn't know how to direct them to Jesus. I just kept affirming that it was he who healed me. Over time, I moved with my family to northern Mexico. There, I continued to affirm that Jesus had healed me, despite the doubts and questions about where he was. I wanted everyone to know and believe that it was Jesus who performed the miracle in my life. We have come to the end of this emotional narrative, where we have seen the transformative power of faith and divine intervention in Jose's life. Now I ask you, in light of such a powerful story, what changes do you feel called to make in your own life? Are there areas where you have been resisting change, transformation, or the call to a deeper faith? What are the modern idols that we might be worshiping without even realizing it? How can we today turn more authentically to the one who promises not just physical healing, but spiritual renewal and eternal peace? Don't let this moment pass without reflection. Share in the comments how this story touched your heart and what steps you plan to take from now on to live a fuller life connected with God. And if you found inspiration, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue exploring and learning about the depth and beauty of the spiritual path of our Savior. Your journey can be as miraculous as Jose's if you allow it to be guided by God.
But around high school, I couldn't wait to turn 18 and leave home so I wouldn't have to go to church anymore because it felt boring and unrealistic. A high school friend sent me a tryout that the baseball team was holding. It was an open audition for dancers for the dance team, kind of like cheerleaders, but you needed to have formal dance training. They don't care about your age as long as you're a pretty girl. They'll let you do anything. I knew how to sing. I ended up meeting producers with studios and started getting involved with music, falling in love with songwriting, recording, and performing. And eventually, I signed with an independent record label. At the time, I was in a relationship with the owner and believed in him because he was my boyfriend. So I trusted that he would take care of me, until I landed a recording contract. I was working on singles, had songs on the radio, and opened for a major famous singer. It was all about songs on the radio, performances for big stars, and radio tours. I was loving all of it. I would just feel an overwhelming fear. In my mind, I felt the Lord saying that there were demons there, but I had let them in. I ignored his voice because I wanted to do what I wanted. I wanted to fulfill my dream. I had a relationship with a producer who was working on my first album to get a major contract. And he had already worked with big names in the industry. He then said something shocking. "Did you know that if you sell your soul to the devil, you can have instant fame by tomorrow?"
If you felt moved by this testimony and want to watch this story and more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Here, we share powerful experiences that can transform lives and strengthen faith. Click the subscribe button, activate the notification bell to receive updates, and join our community of faith and hope.